So once again we had to make people think for themselves because everything is a monopoly.
Yes, if people became aware that the limits they tell you are safe, if they check the facts for themselves, it's easy to see that they are not safe.
Yeah.
That they don't protect against cancer, they don't protect against long-term effects, they don't protect against sleeping problems, they don't protect against the headache you get of the mobile phone use, they don't protect you against Alzheimer's. And ICNIR, when they wrote the article presenting their limits in 1998, they clearly stated that because we have not sufficient research on long-term effects, we only set limits for short-term exposure.
Hello.
Hello.
Mona Nilsson, it's very good to be back in this lovely place on this island. It's so relaxing just driving here out of the Lexusmark from Stockholm and so. You have written a new book called Health Risks of the Mobile Phone. And can you tell us a little bit more about why you wrote the second book? You already wrote the first one called the game about 3G. Please tell us what this book is about.
Well, I wanted to make a more complete book than the game about 3G, and I also wanted to gather together the whole picture of this issue, the industry manipulation of research and their loyal experts. I call it the ICNIR cartel, and I also give some of the most important research that has been done and the results of that research, and also show the history behind why we have those high limits we have today, because originally they were set by the military industry, and they have always been very important for the military systems, and that's why they needed to be protected from the beginning to protect the defense systems that were used by the military. And then in the 80s, the telecommunication industry came in and used the same technique, the same microwaves, and they used these high limits that were originally set for protecting the defense systems. And that is now why they are so hard defending also these high limits, because they are so important from the economic point of view, not only the defense and military point of view, but now also from a very important economic point of view for this industry, but not for the people. For the people, those high limits are really very damaging, because they don't protect us at all against the kind of radiation we are exposed to today.
But it's quite interesting because there are usually no causes for all the illnesses we are having, and they are increasing. Illnesses are increasing all the time. But when you read your new book, of course the English people cannot read it because it is in Swedish, but you know, when you read this book and you see all the studies and you see all the results and you think about the time span when all these things have come forward, you know, you should be quite, I should say, disconnected if you're not able to see the connection between the radiation and most of the health issues we are dealing with today.
Yes, I've been very sad about, of course, hearing very serious illnesses like brain tumors. I often hear people who know somebody who's been has had a brain tumor, and a fatal one. Often people die from brain tumors, and those people have used their mobile phones a lot, and people have understood that probably it was the mobile phone that caused the brain tumor. But also we have other not so serious illnesses that are increasing heavily in the society today, and I think most important is the sleeping problems, and also depressions and other kind of neurological diseases. People are not feeling well, they can't sleep, and this radiation takes away the sleep from us. It prevents us from have a good night's sleep. It prevents the production of our sleeping hormone melatonin, and I'm very concerned about the long-term effects from this effect only on the sleep, because if you sleep poorly for a long time, that in its turns increases the risk for other serious illnesses.
And when we talk, for instance, when we talk about the pineal gland in the brain, it's very sensitive to electrosmog. And it says that if you become an imbalance in that, it might lead to a burnout syndrome. And that's what we see in Sweden and in Denmark. You know, people are burning out extremely.
People are, an enormous amount of people are getting the diagnosis burned out. But behind these diagnoses, I suspect, and many with me suspect, that we have an effect from the heavy exposure from radiation. I write, for example, in my book about a medical doctor who had this diagnosis for several years until she found out that it was the radiation that made her sick.
What about when we talk about HDH? HD, yeah, it's difficult to say, it's different in Danish. But in Denmark we had, I thought it was last week, we saw that there was a 600% increase in 4 years in the use of Ritalin. And then the government says, oh, the school teachers must be re-educated so they can better handle the hyperactive children. But there's no talk about the cause.
I'm very concerned about the young children and the whole young generation growing up now with this enormous exposure from this radiation and the long-term effects it will have on them. In Sweden, for example, the sleeping pill prescriptions have skyrocketed the last 5 or 6 years. And the worst thing is that people are not being told that this radiation can be the cause of their sleeping problems, and probably is in a lot of the cases. Instead they are giving sleeping pills, and people are feeling bad. And I think it's really criminal not to tell them, not to let them know, and to forcefully expose them to this radiation from the masts and the mobile phone base station antennas.
Yeah, there's a huge manipulation going on, and propaganda. So your book is excellent because it describes all these things, and it even mentions some Swedish persons who are, I should say, on the dark team without. You mentioned something about that they are actually trying to prevent people from educating themselves about what is going on in this field.
Yes, they are doing this all the time. The Swedish Radiation Protection Authority wanted to do that already a couple of years ago. I wrote about it in my first book, how they employed a propaganda firm named Kreab, which was also at the same time the propaganda PR firm for Ericsson, an investor, and Hi3G. And now in this book I write about a conference that was being held and paid for by the European Commission, which was being held in Italy a couple of years ago, which was about risk communication, but not telling us the truth, the people the truth, but how to manipulate people, how to tell people that this technique is free from risks. And this conference was full of people from the telecom industry who discussed these topics together with the authorities and the experts from the ISTINA cartel.
I visited Professor Otto Johansson earlier today, and he was talking about the ignorance that people are, like you do very much, talk about people are you can say, held in ignorance. They are being told lies all the time and they don't know what to think anymore. We were also talking about if people really are able to think anymore, because it seems like Denmark, Sweden, perhaps Norway too, have been like zombified. It seems like, I don't know if we should say brainwashed or if that's a too hard word to use, but there's something going on here that is very scary in a way.
Yeah, the problem is that the media have not told the people the truth. The media have repeatedly the last years told the public the industry version about the risks and the ISTINA cartel version about the risk. They haven't been able to see through the manipulation and the hiding of the facts, and they haven't even critically looked at the authorities, how they are working and how they are dealing with this issue. Because if they would have done it, like me for example, they would have, only by scratching on the surface a little, they would have seen that there is something that doesn't fit here, that what they are telling is not true, that there are lists like this on research showing huge risks, that there are an abundant amount of people witnessing about the same reactions, the same symptoms that they get from this radiation, from mobile phone masts and Wi-Fi and cordless phones. And those witnesses from people, from the reality, they are so overwhelming, so it's crazy just to ignore them.
There's something rotten not only in Denmark, but in Sweden, Norway, the whole world.
Yeah.
And it's time now that people really, you know, it's really, perhaps it's already over 12 o'clock, you can say, but we are really, it's time to take action now, and not, people have to take action now. It's no more time for discussions really, it's time to take action.
Yes, people have to inform themselves and wake up and don't trust, because they can't trust the authorities anymore, because they are not caring about the people. They are caring about the huge economic interests and this very important industry. So people have to wake up and be more critical and demand that the authorities do their job and protect the people and not the industry.
But they have to make a choice, the people have to make a choice themselves and not depend on other authorities anymore. They have to decide, do I want to run the risk or do I not want to run the risk? They have to decide themselves, because we haven't got time for authorities to wake up really, because how long will that take?
No, they can't even expect the larger media to tell them the truth anymore, because they have not done their work so very good until now. So people have to be more critical from themselves. That's a lesson we have to learn, and we have to change.
Mona Nilsson, we were just talking about page 208 in your new book. Can you please translate what it is you wrote about the manipulation?
Well, this is quite amazing. It's I read a report from the European Commission. It's about a meeting that was taking place in Italy a couple of years ago, where the mobile phone industry met together with representatives from authorities in Sweden and other countries, and experts from the ISTINA cartel, I call them, for example Anders Ahlbom from Sweden. And they were there meeting to discuss how to treat the concerns from the people, how to treat the people with risk communication. And one of their main conclusions was that it was important to prevent people to inform themselves, to build their own opinions about the risk. It was important to prevent that and to be very timely with their information that there are no risks, because if they are not ahead of the people and the people search for information themselves, they very quickly get confronted, as they say, with negative information about the risks, the negative from their point of view. So it's important to prevent that.
This makes me think about, the associate professor Jeanette Quay from Denmark, when she was still functioning.
Yeah.
She had the message coming from the deacon of her university that she was allowed to say everything she wanted, but one thing: she was not allowed to say that it's dangerous.
Okay, that's crazy. But this gives me such, I think this report is so scandalous that it's a European community meeting. They were only discussing the risks for industry. By the risk for industry, I mean that concern from people, because if people are concerned, it's a risk to industry. They didn't bother at all about people getting sick. That was the reality they weren't interested in at all. They were only interested in how to prevent people from getting the facts and being concerned about risks from this technology. And it's not the democratic society that acts like that. It gets me very bad feelings in the stomach, and I think people should feel the same when they read about this also, that they are being manipulated.
Mona Nilsson, when it comes to media and the way the media are manufacturing doubt, what is your view on that thing? The way the media is creating a lot of uncertainty and so for the public.
Well, of course, this is a very powerful industry that are manufacturing the wireless technologies that create huge risk for human health, for our health and our lives, and the environment as well. The environment is also affected by the wireless technology radiation. And of course, this very powerful industry does not want the public to know that there are risks, because that is a risk to the powerful industry. The people getting knowing about the risk is a risk to industry. So of course they put large efforts in keeping the public and the decision makers in the dark about the risks. And one way to do that is through the media. So of course influencing media is a very effective and important way for this industry to reach their goal and to maintain high profits and high sales and high turnover and high stock values for their business. So that is why the public should be kept in the dark. And the way they do this is by influencing journalists and the media. And they also do it by manufacturing science, because many journalists think that we only have to look at what science has shown. And this industry is so powerful that it has always the power to buy science, to buy scientists that produces science showing that the technology is safe and implies no risks for health and environment. So those independent scientists that make studies that show clear risks to humans and to the environment from this technology, their studies are very often countered by studies showing no risks. And for those journalists who doesn't know about and who hasn't got the ability to look behind and see this game going on and to analyze the studies correctly, they can't for themselves judge. So that's why they became megaphones for this strategy of, we can call it manufacturing doubt, which is described by in an American book recently called Manufacturing Doubt, written by a former employee in the Clinton administration. And it's not only this powerful industry that uses this strategy, it's used by many other industries as well, the chemical industry and other industries that doesn't want the public to become aware of the true risks of their business.
This is exactly when I talk to people and tell them something about the wireless technology, they typically say, oh, yesterday it said something in the paper, today it says something else, oh, I just give up, I get so confused.
Yes, yes, people are confused because they get different messages, and also they get the impression, you all often get the answer as well that, well, but the science, the experts don't agree, they don't agree. But when do experts agree? And especially in a field that involves such a lot of money as this, you can always buy experts that don't agree. You can always see to it that experts don't agree. But what really matters is that we have to look behind this illusion that we don't know anything. You have to check the facts for yourself, and the facts are clear as the water. The facts say that there are huge health risks, there are huge risks for the growing generation, the children growing up, and there are huge risks in the long term from this technology. And the fact is that people are already getting sick, very sick, in large number all over the world. And in Sweden, for example, we have more and more refugees that can't live in their homes, that have to go away to areas where there are very few people, out in the woods to get away from the radiation. And I think that is criminal, to make people be refugees in their own country. And I don't think we have seen this ever before in modern history, that we have had so many people that can't live in their homes, that are refugees in their own countries, in countries considered as democracies like Sweden, for example. And what is awful as well is that the authorities and the governments, they pretend not to see those refugees. They pretend that we should not bother about what is happening in reality. We shall always only bother about science, what science has shown and not shown. And since it is always possible to produce science that is favorable for this industry, this can go on forever, and we have a reality out there which is awful. So we have to wake up and start to look around us and start to look at the facts that are there, that this technology is dangerous for humans and for the environment.
And journalists especially have to wake up and decide and think for themselves, you can say, because they are just repeaters actually. They're just repeating what science says that they must say, or government says they must say.
Yes, many journalists don't analyze critically, but they are repeaters. They are megaphones for what experts say, for what the authorities say, and this industry say. So people have to wake up and analyze and think critically about what they read in the magazines and in the newspaper and what they hear in the media, and start to think for themselves. Hopefully, and luckily, we still have internet as a wonderful source for information where you can check the facts for yourself. It's like Linus Pauling, the 2 times Nobel laureate, he said, don't trust the experts, check the facts for yourself, and that's still valid today.
Children are the future, you can say.
Yeah.
Are we taking care of the children relating to the electrosmog and the wireless society and the technologies?
Of course not, we are. Because now the children are seen upon as a growing market segment for this mobile phone industry, the wireless technology industry. And more children are using mobile phones. In fact, the children are guinea pigs. Because now the society and certain researchers are starting to study if the children that uses the mobile phones, if they are at higher risks for developing brain tumors than children than other children. If the use of mobile phones has put them into higher risks of developing dangerous brain tumors. And I think that's totally unacceptable. We should know before we give the children a mobile phone. We should know before if it is a risk for developing such a serious disease. We shouldn't give them a mobile phone saying that it is safe and afterwards controlling if they got a serious disease of the mobile phone use. But that is in fact what is happening today.
It's a live experiment, you can say.
Yes, it's a live experiment, and the parents and the children are not told that it is an experiment. They are told that there are a large amount of studies that has shown that the mobile phone use is safe, and in fact it's really the contrary, because on one hand we have a growing amount of studies showing that there are considerable risks for health by using mobile phones. And on the contrary, the mobile phones, and on the other hand, the mobile phones were introduced without any studies showing that they were safe. So this should be, in a sound society, be considered as totally unacceptable, letting children be part of a huge experiment. And we know today, unfortunately, that there are huge risks for developing brain tumors, for developing neurological damage to the brain, and other diseases as well, because it's not only the brain that is damaged by this radiation. We have research from the Lund University on rats showing that the major effects from the mobile phone occurs on the rats, at least 1 meter away, 1 meter distance from the mobile phones. So that's really intriguing and makes you think.
But what about, I have heard someone said that children should not be more sensitive to all these things. Some scientists, they step out and say, oh, children are not more sensitive. Is that...
Yes, for example, the Swedish Radiation Protection Authority falsely claims that no research has been able to show that children are more sensitive. That's completely rubbish. We know from most areas that environmental agents, regarding environmental agents, chemicals, radiation and so forth, that children are more sensitive, and that's because they have growing bodies, they have developing central nervous system, and their cell renewal is faster. So they are definitely more sensitive. And for example, the World Health Organization has stated several times that children has a specific sensitivity. They are more vulnerable to environmental agents than grown-up people. And regarding this mobile phone radiation, several scientific studies has shown that the radiation penetrates more deeply into a children's brain. But of course, the acknowledgement that the children are more sensitive is of course a risk to this powerful industry, because they see children as a growing market segment that should not be stopped by anybody claiming that children would be more sensitive. So that's why, for example, the Swedish Radiation Protection Authority stubbornly refuses to acknowledge that children is more sensitive.
Yeah, it seems that they are living in a completely other world when they say things like that.
Yes, it's completely rubbish.
Yeah.
Everybody who thinks for themselves understands that that is completely rubbish.
Yeah.
We know from so many experience from the past that children is specifically sensitive, and we have also shown, which is very intriguing, a study that showed that mothers who used their mobile phones, the radiation from the mobile phone affected the heart rate of the fetus, the child in the stomach of the mother, and even the newborn babies were affected by their heart rate, were affected by radiation from the mobile phone, and the effect was higher the younger the child or the fetus was. So this is definitely a signal, a strong warning signal, that children are more sensitive, and they are more sensitive the younger they are. So they should be protected from this.
Would it be too hard to say that this is actually a betrayal? This is a betrayal of children and the future generation?
Of course it is a betrayal when we don't tell people and the children what we know about the risks. Instead of telling them, we know there are huge risks with this radiation, we say that it's completely safe. You can give the mobile phone to your child to be more secure, to feel more secure. You can call the child whenever you want to check that he is okay. Instead, perhaps you give the child a death sentence. The child will have a brain tumor in 10 years and die from it. Most people die from brain tumors, malignant brain tumors.
Okay, so we can just conclude that this is a big betrayal and that people should really wake up now and think for themselves.
Yes, people should consider the facts for themselves. Not trust what the media tell them, not trust what the authorities tell them, not trust what the industry tell them, because they speak with dollars in front of their eyes. They only think of the revenues and the money and the damage the acceptance of a risk would imply for this very powerful industry. So we have to start to think more critical and be more aware and take more care of our children. You wouldn't give your children a glass with a poison in it and tell it to drink it because it's absolutely safe when you know there are risks with it. But that is in fact what we are doing to our children now with the mobile phones.
Mona Nilsson, the more I dig into this about radiation and the wireless technology, I get the feeling that we are talking about a huge, big lie. A big lie that's so big that almost everyone should be able to see it.
Yes, and everybody is unfortunately affected also by this big lie. And there are several big lies in this area. For example, but the most awful lie, I think, is that we are told that the radiation we are exposed to in our own homes, if we want it or not, we have no choice. Many of us are involuntarily exposed to this radiation, which is an intruder in our own homes, in our own private lives. We are told that it is perfectly safe, that science has not been able to show any effects whatsoever by exposing people at this, what they call low-level radiation. Any scientist has not been able to show this. That's an awful lie, because on one side, the radiation is not low. It is only low if you compare it to the limits that are set by the International Commission on Non-Ionization Radiation. And those limits are only protect us against effects that occur immediately from very short exposure. We talk about 6 or 30 minutes, depending on what you refer to. We are not told that those limits do not protect us against exposure for 24 hours, for 1 week, for 1 year, and 2 years and 3 years and so forth. We're only told that we have limits that are set with high precaution and that the radiation is far below those limits. But those limits have nothing to do whatsoever with long-term exposure from this radiation. The kind of exposure we are actually exposed for from those base station and the mobile phone antennas and the DECT phones and so forth, and the Wi-Fi and the WiMAX and the 3G and the GSM. So this is a big lie. We're also told that the science has never been able to show any effects. All the science that has been done, all the studies that has been done on people exposed for longer periods from base station antennas has clearly shown that there are considerable health risks. Studies have shown that there are increased risk for cancer, and studies have shown that there are increased risk for the symptoms that make part of what we call the microwave syndrome and the radiofrequency sickness that was described by East European scientists already in the 1960s and the 1970s. And those include heart problems, sleeping problems, headache, dizziness, lack of concentration, depression, and so forth. Those kind of symptoms that make up the microwave syndrome. And what's even more worrying is that people all over the world are witnessing that they experience just those symptoms that are described in the microwave syndrome. People are witnessing that they see more cancers in areas highly exposed from mobile phone antennas. And still we are told we have not seen anything and that and this is perfectly safe. When in fact the intruder, the wireless radiation, is a high risk for your life and for your health. And that's an enormous betrayal against humanity, I think, to expose people against their will in their own homes for an agent that is causing problems for their health, and that is in the long run is life-threatening, can be for especially vulnerable segment of the population. And it is done under the illusion that it is perfectly safe.
I remember in 2001 Professor Santoni from France.
Yeah.
He came out with his master study.
Yeah.
And when you look at the symptoms there, it all showed the same things, and people suffering from all these things, nearby masks.
Yes.
And he was shut up as well.
Well, his study was very criticized.
Yeah.
But the problem is that his study has been repeated by other scientists afterwards, and they have repeatedly shown the same effects on people from the base station, the 24 o'clock long-term exposure from this radiation. And the big problem is that reality tells us the same thing. People are witnessing about the same problem, about the sleeping problems, and the authorities and the governments neglect this. They pretend this doesn't happen. They pretend that those studies doesn't show anything. And they say, this is perfectly safe, so we don't need to take the initiative to make any studies.
Well, it is a big lie, and again we will have to encourage people to wake up and to start to think for themselves and take their power back, because they cannot trust their government, their authorities, the industry, or the science anymore. They have to decide for themselves.
Yes.
Many people can't sleep today.
No.
They really suffer from bad sleep. What do you think? How does it relate to the wireless society and technology and stuff?
Yes, we really have a sleeping problem epidemic in the Western world of today. I think this problem is the same in Sweden as in other European countries and in the USA. The statistics say that the sleeping problems are increasing, and they are increasing to levels we have never seen before in our society. There are some studies showing that hardly nearly 50% of the Swedish population have sleeping problems today. And the tragedy of all this is that the young generation, the teenagers and children, are increasingly also having sleeping problems. This part of the population that normally should sleep as good, you sleep the best in your life when you're young and a child. And today many children and teenagers have sleeping problems. And the tragedy is that when the sleeping problems and the increasing problem of this is discussed in the media, they never talk about the wireless technology as a big cause of this problem. And still the sleeping problem curve is the same. It coincidences with the increase in the wireless technology radiation. And we have a large amount of studies showing that the sleeping hormone melatonin is negatively affected by radio frequency and microwave radiation. And we also have a lot of studies from laboratories showing that the brain's electrical activity is influenced also by this radiation. So we know from the science that this radiation can have huge impacts on sleep. And sleeping problems are furthermore the most frequent symptom that people witness about from that are having problem and that can relate clearly their problems to the exposure of this radiation from mobile phone, moths and base station antennas. So there is clearly a connection. Still, this is never discussed in the media, that the radiation can be the cause of the sleeping problem. And of course this is awful, that people try to treat their sleeping problems by all other means, and they don't go to the source of the problem because they are not informed about this problem. Because of course, like all other problems with this wireless technology, is a big threat to a very powerful industry. So that's why we are not we're not given this information. And of course it's a tragedy to have sleeping problems for a longer period, can cause serious threats to your health and can be the root of many other health problems, which is well known by sleeping experts on sleep.
I heard, I think it was a Swedish doctor or something, he said he has invested in, not invested, or he has researched, you can say, in sleeping patterns, and he saw that if people were using a mobile phone in the evening, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the evening, people's brainwave activity would not be normal until 3 o'clock in the night. And when I've been advising people to get rid of their decked cordless phone at home, they have within 3-4 days, you say, come back and said, we sleep much better now.
Yes.
In just 3-4 days.
And we have so many witnesses of experience from real life that people say, when I get back to my apartment in the town, I can't sleep. But when I go out to my country cottage, where there are no mobile phone antennas, I discovered that I can sleep. I sleep as a child, they say. But when they come back to town, they can't sleep again. And this is the way many people have discovered that the mobile phone antennas or the decked phone is the cause of their sleeping problems, by experiencing, by cutting off the exposure, and then they can sleep again. So, of course, this is a tragedy that so many people, and especially the children and the teenagers who are having sleeping problems, are not informed that this can be the problem, and instead you give them sleeping pills. And the prescription of sleeping pills to young children has doubled or tripled the last year in Sweden, and that is really an awful thing to see.
But then people say, oh, if you can't sleep in the city, it's because there's so much noise. But then again, if we use this kind of microwave detector that actually transform what we cannot hear with our ears, so we can hear what noise it really is, then we get it again, that the microwaves are making a noise, you can say, or the influence it does is really heavy.
Yes, by the microwave detector you can easily check the level of the radiation from the wireless technology in your home. So that is an instrument I recommend everybody to get. I consider the microwave detector to be an indispensable tool for everybody to have in their home, to be able to check what radiation levels you are exposed to, because this can change from one day to another. If you have a neighbor who installs a wireless network, computer network, or a wireless telephone, or if a mobile phone antenna is raised in your neighborhood, you have the possibility to check and to be aware of what you are exposed to. So I think this is a great tragedy that so many people are kept in the dark about the real source of their sleeping problem, the real cause of their sleeping problems. So I recommend all people to check the facts for themselves, and if they do, they can clearly see that this radiation is negatively affecting the sleep, and that this has been warned from credible and very well-informed scientists for many years now. Among them, for example, Professor Santini from France. He said already in 2003 that it was perfectly shown, it was proved scientifically, that this radiation negatively affects the sleep, and the radiation from mobile phone antennas in your neighborhood.
Okay, then we can just say that when people take care of their wireless technology and get rid of it, then they can go back to sleep again.
Yes, normally if they don't have a mobile phone antennas in the neighborhood, which is more difficult, but then at least that perhaps they can try to move to another place, or to reduce it by putting up some shielding material in the area where they sleep. And if people who have done this, they have discovered that they can start to sleep again.
Mona Nilsson, are we having an expert monopoly in the field of electromagnetic waves and wireless society today?
Yes, definitely, and that's also a huge problem for a democratic society, I believe, because the decision makers and the public are not given the truth and the whole side of the story. They're just given one part of the story, and you can say that it's a very biased part of the story. And you can see it as it's an invisible hand that has placed the right experts and the right experts for the mobile phone industry, that will give the mobile phone industry good messages, and the decision maker good messages all the time. And you can see those experts, they're popping up in different chairs, regularly in different countries, and even at the EU level and the World Health Organization level. And often the strings always go back to one organization, and that organization is ICNIRP, the International Commission for Non-Ionization Radiation. And this is an organization which is very important for the mobile phone industry, because this is the organization that has set the limits for the radiation that the technology are allowed to emit. And these limits that the ICNIRP has set do only protect against acute effects, immediate effects that occurs from very short exposure. We talk about effects that has been seen in research on animals that has been exposed to very high levels for 30 minutes, and you see the effects immediately. So those limits has nothing to do with long-term exposure, the kind of exposure that people are exposed to from this radiation today, and increasingly. But those experts that have ties to the ICNIRP, they don't tell people that, and the authorities don't tell people that those limits are only protecting against acute effects and short-term exposure, because that, of course, is a big threat to the industry, because the industry considers those limits as very good, and stricter limits is clearly considered by the industry as a big threat to their revenues, to their economy. And anybody who wants to investigate this can clearly see that the dependence from the mobile phone industry on those limits in their annual reports, where you can see that they consider stricter limits as a risk to their business. So there is a clear dependency between the ICNIRP and the mobile phone industry. And then it's very easy to see that it's very important for this industry to have experts that defend the ICNIRP limits. And that's exactly what those experts are doing. That sets on many countries expert investigations in this issue. They don't accept research showing effects under the ICNIRP limits. They clearly defend the ICNIRP limits. And even at the World Health Organization, the person who started the ICNIRP was lately, in 1996, he became responsible for this whole issue at the World Health Organization. His name is Michael Repaccioli, and he defended also the ICNIRP levels at the World Health Organization. So, and he, at the World Health Organization, has surrounded him by experts also loyal to the ICNIRP limits. So, wherever you look in this issue, you see experts that are loyal to the ICNIRP limits, and by that, indirectly loyal to the mobile phone industry, that are making investigations and giving decision makers advice on how to handle this issue. And the message is from them that there are no risks. And all the scientists that clearly see risks and want to warn the public and the decision makers about the considerable health risks on long term from this radiation, they are never invited in the expert group.
Talking about all these experts, I believe I have come across the name Anders Albom from Sweden many times.
Yes.
In different situations. Can you tell me a little about this guy, because I get a bit confused when I see all his...
No, Anders Albom, he has a lot of responsibility in this issue, because on one hand he's a member of ICNIRP. He was a member of ICNIRP and took part in setting the limits in 1998 for ICNIRP. And he is also having a monopoly on this issue as an expert in Sweden, because he is the chairman of the two expert groups on the issue in Sweden. He is chairman of the Swedish Radiation Protection Authority expert group, and he's chairman of another expert group. And the secretary of both those expert groups is Maria Feisting, who is also a member of ICNIRP, who is the organization that set the limits. And interestingly, of 8 members in the Swedish Radiation Protection Authority expert group, 6 are members or consulting members of ICNIRP. So, of course, when you see their conclusions in every report that they make, it's interesting to see that, of course, they defend the ICNIRP limits, and they don't accept science that shows effects below the ICNIRP limits, showing that the ICNIRP limits are not protective against health effects of this kind of radiation. And furthermore, Anders Albom, he also is a chairman of the European Commission expert group on this issue. He led the CENIR investigation in this issue. He is also involved in various experts committees in other countries and at the World Health Organization. And this is a tendency that you see, that several persons sit on many expert chairs, and what a person who is not has not looked deeply into this issue doesn't see is that when they refer in their investigations to other expert group and other investigations into this issue, they can't see that in fact they are referring to themselves. For example, the Swedish Radiation Protection Expert Group refers to the CENIR expert group. It doesn't say that the chairman is the same and that he refers to himself. And that's very common in this issue. You see the same persons popping up everywhere, and they are all defending that there are no risks with this radiation.
So this is really a huge betrayal. This is beyond words, because it's so obvious.
It's not honest, because of course we have a lot of research showing clearly that there are risks.
Yeah.
And we also have a lot of scientists whose opinions don't come through in these reports. They are not shown in these reports. But they are starting to get together in other organizations. For example, we have recently in this year, 2008, we have the Venice Resolution, where over 50 scientists from all over the world signed a document where they demanded stricter limits, because the limits we have today, the ICNIRP limits, are not protective against health effects. And they also stated that we have clearly seen signs that is showing serious health effects from this kind of radiation. You also have the Bioinitiative group who made a report in 2007 that also clearly stated that electromagnetic fields is a health risk. They also demand lowering of the ICNIRP limits, and they also stated that it's not acceptable to continue business as usual.
Okay, what about when we talk about these ICNIRP limits? How come Russia and Italy and Switzerland have much lower limits than we do? Are they not under the ICNIRP?
No, they haven't accepted the ICNIRP paradigm, that this radiation can only cause acute effects and not effects from long-term exposure.
But isn't that a problem with Italy? Italy is part of the European Union. And how come some European Union's countries are not into the ICNIRP and others are? Isn't that
Well, that shows clearly the issue, the problem, that you get different answers in this issue depending on who you ask. If you ask the ICNIRP experts, they say there's no problem under our limits. They defend their own limits. But if you ask other experts, they say clearly we see effects under the ICNIRP limits, and it's not acceptable to accept limits that only protect against effects from acute exposure, from acute short-term exposure, because we clearly see that there are other effects from this radiation. But the problem is that there are few countries that have sufficient limits. Even if Italy has lower limits and Russia also have lower limits, they are not safe enough. But the best protective and the foremost recommendation in the world, I think, is the recommendation from the health authority in the Salzburg department in Austria, that recommends a limit that is million times lower than the ICNIRP limits. And the ICNIRP limits, the experts from the World Health Organization clearly show also that they defend the ICNIRP limits, because the World Health Organization has strongly worked for promoting the ICNIRP limits and has tried to convince countries with lower limits to raise them to the ICNIRP limits. So this is a clear tendency. Depending on who you ask, and if you have connection to ICNIRP, you work for the ICNIRP limits.
When you say that they have tried to make countries raise their limits,
yeah,
isn't Michael Rappioli, you can say one of the, I should term him as a bad guy, isn't he working in a university in Italy at the moment?
Yes, I think he is.
In a country that is below the ICNIRP term?
Yeah, I don't know what he actually does today at the university, but during his service at the World Health Organization, you clearly see a tendency that the World Health Organization worked as a PR agency for promoting the ICNIRP limits, which is loved and very supported by the mobile phone and telecommunication industry. So when you analyze the work done and the activities done, you clearly see that the World Health Organization worked as a PR agency for the mobile phone telecommunication industry.
I think we have been over this many times, but the most important thing now is that people should really get up and wake up.
Yes, people can't trust. People can't trust their authorities. You can't trust the mobile phone industry telling them that the Wi-Fi, the DECT phones, or the 3G phone, or the GSM phone, or the mobile phone base station next to your house is safe. It's not safe. People have to start to check the facts for themselves, and when they do it, they clearly see that the radiation that this technology emits, it's not safe for their health, for their children's health. It's a great risk for medium-term effects, and especially for long-term, very serious effects like cancer or Alzheimer's or other serious illnesses. So I really strongly recommend people to take responsibility for their own lives and their own health and check the facts for themselves, because we cannot longer trust what you read in the newspaper or what you hear.
The healthcare system or the doctors, they're all saying the same and just repeating what WHO says, and it's all just...
Yes. Because this industry is so powerful that it has a lot of resources to spread out information that is positive for their business. And that's why we really have to wake up, and people have to take responsibility for their children's health. And children shouldn't use mobile phones except in emergencies, and follow the recommendation from more and more cancer experts, brain surgeons, and conscious scientists from all over the world, who are more and more strongly recommending against mobile phone use by children, especially children under the age of 12, who are the most vulnerable. And
I just heard from Australia, a brain surgeon, a known brain surgeon down there. He said that even though they say there's not enough science about this, he recommends all people not to use mobile phones or anything, because he can see a clearly correlation between brain tumors and the use of mobile phones.
Yeah, and this disease is so horrible. To have a malignant glioblastoma, which is the serious risk from mobile phone use, that's such an awful disease. I know of several people who have had it, and they they can't survive long from that. They die within 3 months or 6 months. So it's really a horrible disease, and you wouldn't wish your worst enemy to have it, especially not your own children. So people should really start to not to give their children a mobile phone anymore, and to start to be aware that the radiation is very detrimental in the long run.
So wake up now, please.
Yes.